Joan Esposito, live, local, and progressive.
Take her away, Ian.
Yeah, take it away, Ernie. It's going to be a bumpy ride.
Joan Esposito.
Whoa, that's an explosive sentence.
On WCPT 820.
I am pleased to welcome back to our program Behnam Ben Taleblu. Sorry, I'm having a little bit of brain fog. I've just been in bed for like the last 10 days with COVID. So please, if my questions are a little confusing today, Behnam, please just bear with me and try to make sense of what I'm saying. I'm doing the best I can with what I've got, which seems to be very little. So...
goodness, not to worry. Great to be back with you, Joan, and wishing you a speedy recovery.
Thank you. At least I can speak today. Yesterday, halfway through the show, my voice just stopped temporarily, which was a real treat for my radio listeners. Anyway, I brought you back. Originally, when we reached out, I wanted to talk more about Iran, but that was before there started to be this new reporting about rebels in the civil war in Syria making some serious advances. Please talk to us about that situation.
Yeah, for about 4+ years now, media and world and political attention had turned away, not just from Syria proper, or only it would kind of pop up when there was an Israeli raid or something by an Iran-backed militia moving there. We really lost sight of the fact that there had been for over a decade a contest between the state and the street, and then that contest had yielded violence, and that violence was taken advantage of by foreign and domestic actors who were armed insurgents, Islamists, jihadists. You had all sorts of folks running in there, Al-Qaeda in there, ISIS in there. But in 2020, there was a brokered, I don't want to say ceasefire, but sort of stalemate via Turkey and less so Russia in the northwest in this historic and important city called Aleppo, that in 2016, after many years of a siege, Iran-backed forces as well as Russia helped the Assad regime liberate. And Turkey, which has backed its own kind of armed Islamist faction in much of this multi-sided, kaleidoscopic Rubik's Cube of a Syrian civil war, many of which have ties to very dangerous Islamist terrorist organizations, have had their own separate sets of interests here. And for America and the West, which is looking at what its interests and what its values are here, Turkey's been a confounding factor because it's a NATO country. It's the second biggest army in NATO, but it's worked primarily, but not exclusively, but primarily against the Kurds who occupy part of the east and the north of Syria, and that's where the big border is with Turkey. And much of Turkey's formal and indirect military operations have been designed to break the Kurds, who have been largely America's partner in the fight against ISIS. And the reason America picked the Kurds as its partner many years ago in the fight against ISIS is because the Kurds were willing to target ISIS alone, whereas many of the Arab armed assailants, some of which later on became terrorist organizations or later on linked up with terrorist organizations, basically wanted to first go after Assad, the dictator of Syria who lives in Damascus. And so long story short, for the past 4 years, there's been this illusion of peace because this Turkish and Russian brokered stalemate in the northwest. And then there were reports that HTS, this group, which is a successor of a previously Al-Qaeda-linked organization, had really said that there was going to be an offensive earlier this year. They were thwarted. They decided against it. They were detected. There's multiple reasons why this offensive that happened late last Friday, Saturday, didn't happen earlier, but nonetheless, it happened late last Friday, Saturday, and really you began to see the Assad regime's armed forces, the Syrian army, melt away, first from two historic cities, Aleppo then, and much more recently today, large parts of Homs. And so these Turkey-backed forces, coupled with some other nefarious terrorist organizations, have basically moved further and have cleared a path to advance against Assad in Damascus. And in lieu of this, Russians are doubling their efforts to save him, but also that country that you mentioned at the lead of this show, the Islamic Republic of Iran, which is the chief arsonist of many of these fires in the region. And now for the Israelis, the Americans, some of the Arab states in the region, the question is, now what? The UAE, for example, is quite keen to foster some sort of a diplomatic maneuver to split Iran from Assad and the Russians. The Israelis are looking kind of cautiously, almost channeling a line ascribed to, at one time, Henry Kissinger and at one time Menachem Begin, basically looking at the two sides and saying what those individuals were purported to have said during the 1980-1988 Iran-Iraq war, which is a shame that both can't lose.
You mentioned a few minutes ago that the Assad forces melted away when the other forces came to Aleppo and the other city. Does that mean that their leaders ordered them to pull back? Does that mean that there is support for this and this was a choice they made to walk away? I'm curious about why that would happen. I mean, I can't imagine if there were any kind of civil war in the United States that the military would simply melt away from Indianapolis, if the forces that were trying to, disrupt the country took Indianapolis. I'm curious about that.
Well, I mean, many have made several analogies, but God forbid we transpose a lot of the Middle East fighting onto American politics. So I think, like you, I do worry from all sides about, God forbid, later on, the prospect of political violence. And I think that's something as citizens we need to be vigilant against. But nonetheless, as it relates to Assad's forces, I think it's just a classic command and control issue. One might say, wouldn't the fear of a group like HTS, Harakat Tahrir al-Sham, coming at you inspire you to fight against them even further? But for places where the troop morale is low, where this was seemingly unexpected, where training is poor, and in general troop discipline is low, faced with a surprise offensive or really an operation that has both breadth and depth, these kind of tactics, melting away, retreating in a rather disorganized fashion, putting up limited bouts of resistance are not uncommon. And so I think the Assad regime is ceding territory. They are regrouping. They are desperate for their international partners like the Iranians and the Russians to muster support. There's already allegations that the Russians would be using some of their proxy forces in Syria, potentially some of the Africa Corps. We know Wagner, for example, the other group, had already been in Syria in the past. We know that via the Iranians, via social media, the Afghan brigade that the Iranians created to help bail out Assad in the past, the Fatimiyun were present and are being called up again. We know that from public reporting, the Iran-backed militias in Iraq, which occupy a critical border between Iraq and Syria, have crossed that border as part of the larger fight to save the Assad regime. And so the million-dollar question will be, given Israel's military successes against Hezbollah, and given the fact that Hezbollah played such a crucial role as part of the connective tissue in this axis of resistance to save Assad in the past when they intervened militarily in that Syrian civil war starting in 2013, will Lebanese Hezbollah be able to, after the beating is taken from the Israelis, be able to once again cross over and once again work on behalf of Iran to bail out the Assad regime in Damascus?
What form would this aid, the aid that Assad wants from Iran and from Russia, other than the Wagner Group? Because, to fight the war in Ukraine, it seems like Putin has recruited North Korea to help there with the thousands of troops that were sent over and are being used in Ukraine. And I know Russia, they have a very large population, but they've also taken an extraordinarily large number of casualties in Ukraine. So what kind of, how much money is Putin willing to spend on Syria? What can the help really be? And I guess I'm asking the same of Iran as well.
Well, I think this is just a worthwhile reminder that for both of those countries, which have taken quite a beating, I mean, the Russians now, again, are on the offensive in Ukraine, given that war has shifted into a war of attrition, and with the military rates of production and kind of lacking Western resolve, things are looking like they'll favor the Russians, at least in the short term, in Ukraine. Plus, of course, you have the added winter factor there. And the Iranians have seen in the post-October 7 Middle East, but more importantly, in the past, I would say, since late July, early August, much of their axis of resistance take a significant beating. They're not destroyed, but they face some significant setbacks in Gaza, where Hamas is, in Lebanon, where Hezbollah is, in Syria, where the Assad regime is, and some of the Iran-backed militias, and certainly the Houthis who are in Yemen, all have been really pushed back on militarily and rapidly by the Israelis overtly and covertly. And given that both Russia and Iran are financially strapped, financially cash-strapped to begin with, this does put them in a bind. But that nonetheless gets us away from the conversation about capabilities and that which they would provide Assad with, which is almost exclusively military aid, equipment, men, trainers, advisors, fighters, proxy fighters, foreign fighters. I mean, you mentioned the North Koreans in Ukraine on behalf of Russia, for example. I remember there were videos from earlier in the Ukraine war about Russia lying to get Nepali workers onto the battlefield in Ukraine. There are reports just recently of the Russians looking to use a proxy of Iran, the Houthis in Yemen, to get them to fight on allegedly quote-unquote worker programs via Russia into Ukraine. So creativity, unfortunately, does favor these kinds of states, and we have seen them be able to use foreign fighters in different theaters before. But the kind of aid that they would give would be lethal and would be military. And the reason they would surge, despite one thinking both Russia is divided and distracted and Iran is distracted, is because for both of their foreign and security policies, particularly the ideology of both authoritarians, Putin in Moscow and Khamenei in Iran, keeping Syria in their orbit and keeping the Assad regime afloat is critical. For the Russians, that's their port into the Mediterranean. That's long been their arms sales partner. The Russians are, fond of saying they have good relations with all sides. It's the Assad regime that gives them a bridge to do that. And the Iranians know that the Assad regime and Syrian territory writ large is their bridge into Lebanon, where their most important proxy is Hezbollah, and it's their bridge into the Eastern Mediterranean and part of this critical constellation of this belt of instability that Iran-backed forces flow men, money, and munitions against throughout the entire northern tier of the Middle East. So geopolitically, strategically, ideationally, Syria matters very much for Iran and Russia, and we'll see them act on how much it matters, despite how many setbacks both regimes have faced.
I'm speaking with the senior fellow at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies, Behnam Ben Taleblu. We are going to take a real quick break and be back with more after this.
Now back to Joan Esposito, live, local, and progressive on WCPT 820.
I'm speaking with Behnam Ben Taleblu, senior fellow at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. We started this conversation talking about Syria. You mentioned a couple of minutes ago Saudi Arabia either playing a role or wanting to play a role. I know that right before the October 7th attack by Hamas on Israel, that Saudi Arabia was very close to reaching some kind of an agreement with Israel. What is it that Saudi Arabia wants to happen in this region, and what, if anything, can they do about it?
Forgive me, I meant the United Arab Emirates, the UAE there. Oh. But the Saudis are obviously the biggest player in the GCC, in this entity called the Gulf Cooperation Council. And with the ascension of MBS, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, you've seen a lot of shifts in Saudi Arabia's regional policy, domestic policy. The fact that right before COVID, for example, let me just use this as an example, Saudi Arabia invited Persian singers to a large party to perform at, to a large venue to perform at a historic Nabatean archaeological site called Al-Ula in the north of that country in the desert. So there is a lot of cultural game-changing things going on the ground in Saudi Arabia that could have a positive ripple effect for much of the war-torn Middle East. The challenge Saudi Arabia will face is not just, navigating the politics of the Arab street versus the Arab state, particularly with the Palestine issue in the post-October 7 Middle East. The challenge is that it's much harder to build as the Saudis are doing, than to destroy, which is what much of this Iran-backed axis is doing, and really what will be coming the more Israel continues to push back militarily against a lot of Tehran's terror proxies. That's not a call to not push back, but it's a realization that war will be extended because the Israelis have now found that while there may not be a military solution, there's at least a military option in some of these theaters. And while Saudi Arabia and Israel are actually more so on the same page than ever before, and that should allow both the outgoing Biden administration and the incoming Trump administration to find ways to, again, foster normalization so that the pro-American partners in the region can talk to one another more so that there's a more stable order. This crisis that we see in the northern tier of the Middle East, this arc of instability, will put limits on that. And it will make risk-averse states like Saudi Arabia constantly have to hedge more. And because it has to protect that which it's been trying to build, it will be, again, more and more risk-averse, which unfortunately will buy space and time for this axis that seeks to destroy, to do that which they're doing. The UAE is playing this hedging game. It's unclear what the Saudi view is of the current situation between Assad and the rebels. But towards the patron of Assad, towards the Iranians, the Saudis used to be, at the front of the helm of having a hawkish position against the Islamic Republic. You might equate that to the classic, 1990s, 2000s Republican position on countering Iran or rolling back Iran in the region, something a la George W. Bush. But a lot has changed with the Yemen war, with the Khashoggi crisis, with the changing American energy dynamics in the region, with the post-Iraq war Middle East. And MBS has really come into his own in this space at a time when America seems to be retreating. And because, again, that's what he's trying to build is fundamentally a more pro-status quo and pro-stability-based order, that means he's not going to be taking a lot of the risks that a lot of the other actors, state and non-state, are taking in this region. And that precisely explains why, at the surface, there may be more contradictions in Saudi policy than meets the eye. The chief example being that despite the unchanged position, deeper in the Saudi court and in the Saudi psyche towards the Islamic Republic of Iran, at the government level, for example, they're continuing their normalization. You now have flights between a major Shia city in Saudi Arabia and a major Shia city in Iran, between Dammam and Mashhad, or Dhahran and Mashhad. And this is, again, important and historic. But this stuff is brought to you by Saudi efforts to not do this out of a genuine change in ideology towards Iran, but trying to hedge, to buy off and accommodate the regime's appetite for aggression so that the Saudis are not at the top of the target list.
You said MBS is coming into his own and is positioned to basically be a huge power in the region. And yet, if I understood you correctly, you also said that MBS is very risk-averse, so that maybe actions that others would take, he would not. Would you talk about that a little bit more?
Well, perhaps as an individual, I would say he's made a lot of bold decisions, the changes in Saudi society. Again, that one concert alone. Much more recently, folks have been pointing to the J-Lo concert, if I'm not mistaken there. There's a lot of things that are happening now in Saudi Arabia that, 10, 15 years ago, one could not have even fathomed happening in other corners of the Middle East. Yet they are happening in Saudi Arabia now, and that is a testament to the bold leadership domestically. The challenge is, as this is filtered through what Saudi Arabia has to do abroad and through the rest of the system in that country, that's where you see that boldness and that desire to achieve with that which they say they would like, which is a lot of the energy, environmental, financial, and even political changes that they have associated with something like Vision 2030 to fundamentally transform Saudi Arabia. They would need stability. They would need peace all around them. And again, that explains why they have pulled punches. in other areas that one might expect them to have traditionally doubled down. For example, Saudi Arabia has a gigantic Red Sea coast, yet Saudi Arabia is not part of any of the maritime coalitions, be it the American and UK-led one or the other EU-led one, to defend against Houthi attacks on international shipping. And while, I would recommend that the Saudis do that they do actually support these multinational maritime coalitions there, the same with Egypt. These two countries have gigantic Red Sea borders. The Saudis would immediately come back and probably say, well, we are one of the few countries who the Houthis in Yemen have not fired at. So, unfortunately, their strategy of accommodation and hedging, which is, in my view, sitting in Washington, thinking about the U.S. national interest, is not the best when you're trying to develop a counter-Iran coalition in the region. But if you're Saudi Arabia and you're trying to get to Vision 2030 and have stability and prosperity be the fundamental driver of the risks that you are willing to take, then that decision makes imminent sense.
I see what you're saying there. We need to take a break, but when we come back, I want to have a discussion with you about what we can expect from American policy under the new Trump regime. I mean, Trump has obviously made it very clear that anything Benjamin Netanyahu wants to do, he is absolutely okay with. And I'm curious as to whether or not that means that Benjamin Netanyahu will be basically creating American policy throughout this entire region, or whether there will actually be American positions on some of these conflicts that might differ from that we see in Israel. We are going to take a real quick break, and then Behnam Ben Taleblu, Senior Fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, and I will be right back after this.
This is Joan Esposito, live, local, and progressive on WCPT 820.
And I am joined by Behnam Ben Taleblu, the Senior Fellow at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. We have been talking about the Middle East, Syria, Iran, and with Donald Trump becoming our next president on January 20th, it seems to me, Behnam, he's going to have a bit of a problem on his hands, because he's a big supporter of Benjamin Netanyahu. He's a big supporter of Vladimir Putin. And in this region, those interests don't seem to align. What do you think is going to be happening with American policy in the Middle East?
Well, I would respectfully recast some of the stuff vis-a-vis Russia, and particularly if we're going to compare it to the Trump Term 1 policy, which at least gave, I think, the Ukrainians a fighting chance, because no matter the botched politics of that phone call, I think, with Zelensky back in the day, we all do remember the transfer, finally, of some of these critical anti-tank weapons like the Javelin that gave Ukrainian forces defending their territory a fighting chance in 2022. But there too, I would look to that other contradiction that will be inherent in his policy, and it's not about Russia or China or his relationship with personal leaders versus the national policy. The contradiction that I worry about is a contradiction that we've seen in every U.S. president's approach towards the Middle East since the end of the second Bush administration, which is no U.S. president will get elected to national politics promising to do more in the Middle East. And yet we've had President Obama, President Trump, President Biden, and then now again President Trump run on platforms of doing less. But each time the policies rooted in the fast-changing realities of the Middle East have required the U.S. to do more. And so if the Trump administration is intent on implementing exactly which that they said they would do in Term 2 against Iran, as well as give the Israelis a freer hand, which is a freer hand against the Iran-backed threat network in the region and maximum economic pressure against the regime in Tehran, well, that will actually require the U.S. to have to do more to defend against the counterpunch that was, with respect, not well defended against in Trump term one. I mean, much of the hedging that we talked about, be it from the UAE or the Saudis, is because when the rubber finally hit the road and they moved into that hawkish position against the Iranians, in 2019, the Gulf Cooperation Council countries saw the U.S. not respond to the downing of its own drone. In 2019, those countries saw the U.S. not come to Saudi Arabia's aid when the Iranians historically launched cruise missiles and suicide drones against the perhaps most critical oil installation on this planet. And then again in 2020, after the U.S. killed Iran's chief terrorist in Iraq, Qasem Soleimani, the U.S. absorbed what it was at that point in time the largest single-day ballistic missile strike in history and the largest ballistic missile strike on U.S. positions since the end of World War II. And so all of this has created an appetite for risk tolerance, not risk aversion, vis-a-vis the Iranians and the Americans. And while the stated goal of the Trump policy will be to get a deal, it remains questionable right now how that will actually happen. And that, I wouldn't say, is necessarily his fault. I mean, right now, again, you have the military option being credibly wielded by the Israelis. You have the Iranian nuclear program, which, due to advances in the past 2 years, they've made knowledge-based gains that even if you have a war or if you have a deal or if you have something else, you can't take this knowledge out of the heads of this regime when it comes to some of these nuclear steps that they've mastered, like enrichment at 60% purity, phasing in more advanced centrifuges, those machines which spin and purify uranium at faster rates with a smaller footprint, making this program easier to hide, harder to bomb, harder to detect, that kind of thing. And then ultimately their production in the past of uranium metal, something they have no immediate civilian need for, and the production of it with 20% enriched uranium, which is a stand-in for highly enriched uranium, meaning the Iranians are essentially trying to learn how to fashion, to build the core for a weapon in plain sight. So all of these things will be forcing functions that will run against the philosophy of Trump, who wants to do less in the region. And all of these things will require the U.S. to be serious and to do more. And in general, even if these things did not exist, he would have to go back to those debates that existed in 2018 and 2019 and 2020 on U.S. policy towards the rest of the region. You know, we had the Abraham Accords stem off some annexation in the West Bank. Well, how do we get Abraham Accords 2.0? And how do you do that in a post-October 7 Middle East? This is a question. The same question will exist for what will the future of U.S. troops in Syria be? I mean, lest we forget, there were bureaucratic games being played galore about how to hide this issue from former President Trump. There were a whole host of times the U.S. president wanted all of these troops out to begin with, whereas I think, in my view, respectfully, that limited number is actually an economy of force mission. I do think that number would have to be scaled up given how serious some of this stuff is going, the serious the counter-Iran threat is in the region, but we also have to now more cleverly weigh that against changing politics in Iraq, as well as, of course, what the future of the Assad regime versus the fight against these Islamist rebels and militants will require us to have to do in Syria. So it is a large mess, and I see no clear overarching strategy. Perhaps it will be articulated later. I would hope it would be articulated later, but thus far there is no prism with which to view the region through.
You mentioned Iran's efforts to get a nuclear program underway. If Iran does become a nuclear power, how does that change the region?
You know, this is something that I'll punt to our European friends who have said this throughout the Bush, Obama, Trump, Biden administrations, which is, and they've been manning the diplomatic posts here. They've been saying, and they've had issues with all of those administrations on Iran policy. But the one reason that has allowed them to stay at the table with us, despite all of our changing politics and political demands during each of those very different administrations, is because there was a baseline consensus that the Islamic Republic of Iran should not be able to have the world's most dangerous weapons, that the world's foremost state sponsor of terrorism should not be able to have the ultimate deterrent. And the Europeans really have rightly rung the alarm bell on the current administration being asleep at the wheel, even not being able to wield diplomatic pressure. And in the face of the Israelis really taking out much more recently a lot of the conventional deterrent apparatus, the drones, the missiles, the terrorist proxies of the Islamic Republic, well, the nuclear imperative, or the imperative to go nuclear, shall we say, for the Islamic Republic is growing. There was periods of time when, many years would pass, 5-6 years would pass, and then Iranian officials once within those 5 or 6 years would, rattle the nuclear saber. That was just rattled, 11 to 14 times in the past month and a half. So the Iranians are taking a page from Putin's playbook, who's rattling his nuclear saber in Ukraine and seeing the dividends, and they may go all the way to try to force President Trump's hand, or they may try to rope-a-dope him diplomatically, just like the North Koreans tried to do back in the day at the at the Singapore summit and at the Hanoi summit. And there really is no simpler answer to your question than all of the problems that we face from the Islamic Republic today. The terrorism, the internal repression and human rights violations, the cyber threat, the missile threat, the drone threat, the arms proliferation threat, the arms sales threat, the maritime instability threat, all of them would be made worse, not better, if this regime gets its hand on a nuclear weapon. And that's why the president cannot afford to take both the outgoing and the incoming one, an a la carte approach to the Iran threat and to the region.
Mm-hmm. It strikes me with Donald Trump giving Benjamin Netanyahu a free rein, a free hand, that we are sort of hoping that Israel does what we won't have to do. That if Israel can get in and make life difficult for Iran and create chaos there, then we don't have to worry about them so much. How much are we hoping that Israel acts as some kind of proxy for us?
Well, if we do come to that hope, I've heard between us, not between us because this is on radio, but for many years now, you've heard that sentiment whispered in various corners of D.C., in the left and the right, because as you know, there's these large swaths of the left and the right that want to forsake much of the world altogether and say, look inward, and they are inspired by, admittedly, the poor track record of the U.S. in many of these theaters. And so they'll say, look inward and outsource it to your partners. But I don't think we can afford to outsource U.S. national security, even to our exceptionally capable partner like the Israelis in this region, because this is not a regional threat. This is a global threat. This is where, in the last question I answered, talking up the Europeans, here I'll dress them down politely. This is where the Europeans, treated for so long the the non-nuclear threats from Iran as an Arab issue or an Israeli issue or merely a Middle East issue. Lest we forget the Quds Force, the regime's terrorist apparatus, had its first foreign operations after the Iran-Iraq war in the former Yugoslavia, in Bosnia. This is a regime that has now moved ballistic missiles and drones onto the European continent. This is a regime that calls the Europeans political midgets, and every time the European posture slightly improves, they threaten, meaning the regime in Tehran threatens to extend the range of its ballistic missiles to put the large mass of the European continent within what is the largest ballistic missile arsenal in the Middle East. So I think that we have to see this through the global lens. It doesn't mean that Iran is a threat on the par of Russia or China, but it does mean understanding that the Islamic Republic occupies a critical nexus in this rising axis of authoritarians. And for us to outsource it to, an exceptionally capable partner would be, I would say, a gross oversight.
I'm talking to Behnam Ben Taleblu, Senior Fellow at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. We are going to take a break. We're going to be back with more after this.
Joan Esposito, live, local, and progressive on WCPT 820.
I'm joined by Behnam Ben Taleblu, Senior Fellow at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. We're talking about the Middle East. Behnam, you alluded to something that I'd like to talk a little bit more. I don't know whether I want to call it a tendency or the fantasy that somehow we can isolate ourselves, that we, just let them figure out their own problems in the Middle East. we should really just focus on us. That has, generally speaking, not been an attitude that has really worked in the past. How prominent do you think that instinct to urge to isolate us is, and will it affect what we do or do not do in the Middle East?
Well, I certainly believe it is an attitude and a sentiment growing on the left, on the right, in some way a bit more organically now on the right, given the discourse on restraint, at least in the foreign policy space. But this is something where the American political spectrum is better understood as a circle, with various points meeting in the middle of that, or meeting on the ends of that circle, rather than just a straight line with left and right. And again, these are temptations and moments in American foreign policy when you do see this retreat, and then you do see a sudden event, a triggering event, Pearl Harbor, for example, or 9/11, for example, that moves the U.S. much more drastically in the exact opposite direction. And this is why I think a healthy conversation now about what are U.S. interests. Proponents of internationalism, proponents of a more muscular foreign policy that need not mean wars or conflicts, but the real vigorous defense of our views, values, and most importantly, interests should be happening. And I think I call on all political leaders, left, right, center, what have you, to kind of resist this populist urge to be able to equate anything to just, that's just another Iraq war hangover, or that doesn't matter, or just dismiss something as a so what. But I say also to be able to answer the so what, to be able to understand why something is or is not in the U.S. national interest. And I think this is a discourse level thing that we need from our politicians or elected political leaders. These are people that we pay to put into office. We can't have them kind of pretend to lead the masses. We need them, to actually lead. And that means articulating a vision of why something is or is not in the U.S. national interest. And with respect, that's a bipartisan critique for me as someone who's been in D.C. just under 2 decades now watching this stuff.
Well, I don't know. I would think nearly 2 decades would give you enough perspective to weigh in on this, particularly since elected leaders kind of come and go. Well, let's talk about that. Give me a compare and contrast. The way you read the world 2 decades ago and the way you read it now.
The biggest thing, and I actually just came back from a tour across much of Western Europe where there is great angst as to what may come in the transatlantic relationship after January 2025, be it not just on, obviously, the Iran issue, which I focus on deeply, but also, Russia-Ukraine, which certainly has an Iran element, but also an element of great power competition on energy, on environment, on trade, on tariff, China, on cyber, you name it. There are concerns, again, as to how do we manage our competition with one another and our conflicts with one another, because this opposite or opposing world order that opposed us then, and we may not have seen it 2 decades ago, and certainly has manifested itself now, is looking to capitalize on our mistakes. So one big thing I see coming, kind of like a bus down the road, is that we don't have a mechanism, or we don't have the willingness or the tendency to compartmentalize our conflicts and our issues with one another. Unfortunately, I see the ability of our authoritarian adversaries to be able to do this quite well. They can downplay the differences and upplay the limited least common denominator. I think, first of all, we need to actually take a page, ironically, from these guys' books and to downplay the differences that we have and upplay the similarities, because we have quite a lot more similarities uniting us with our transatlantic partners than meets the eye. That's the first thing. The second thing is the big change culturally and politically here in D.C. is a real lack of confidence, a real lack of self-confidence. Maybe 2 decades ago, or perhaps just under, there was a real sense of belief in American optimism and American exceptionalism and American spirit. Now, I think when you do talk about these things, you are kind of scoffed at. I would say that given the lack of political accountability in some places in Washington, some might say the military establishment, some might say the political establishment, some might say the financial world, after certain crises happen, whether that's the financial crisis or the botched politics of the Iraq War or the Afghanistan withdrawal, for example, people, meaning the American people, and then in time their views reflected in their elected representatives, have not seen accountability. And when they haven't seen accountability after a crisis begot by people, they tend to shy away from the ideologies. And one of those ideologies was exceptionalism, and one of the derivatives of that exceptionalism was confidence. And so the real big thing I worry about is this lack of self-confidence that actually will force us to handicap ourselves at a time when we need that confidence. Not hubris, but we need the confidence, a real knowledge of what we view, what we value, what is in our interest, and what we can and what we cannot do.
Wow. Do you advise people in the government?
I know. Forgive me.
Who are the people who are listening to you? Who are the people who you believe will do things right, or who you respect? In 12 years with this organization, our comments again, and I do keep my, I wouldn't say advice, but when folks across the spectrum do ask me, I give my advice, particularly on the region and particularly on where things stand with Iran. I'm lucky that I do get quite a bit of bipartisan interest in that which I have to say, whether that's on the Hill in Congress, whether that's been different administrations, and then even whether that's been our friends across the pond in the transatlantic community. And look at some of the things that have been happening. At least I'll give you a very small example in one area that I focus on, which is, again, the countering the Iranian threat. It took Canada 12 years to do something the U.S. took 10 years to do. And that was the prescription or the designation of Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps as a terrorist organization. I had the honor of testifying virtually in Ottawa right before that decision was taken, also endorsing or supporting that decision. But I think if I've been able to garner even a modicum of respect, and now is the time to be humble about it, it's because I look at these things as more of a campaign than an operation. Things in politics are too often treated as a one-off. How can we best the other? But if you present someone, left or right, a Democrat or Republican, American or European, with a vision, with a plan, people will listen to you. And so, again, that's my charge to leaders today. I won't name names of who's been great and who's been a little bit lackluster on these issues. I didn't ask for who was naughty. I only asked for the nice list.
Well, I won't. You can do process of elimination between naughty and nice, but I will say that I've been lucky to have an audience on both sides of the aisle, and also in the military world, in the academic world, and in the policymaking world. Now is the time for reason and rationality, not some of this hyperbole that we see going all around. I'm sorry I can't get more specific than that. But again, this is a nonprofit job where we have the luxury of speaking to all sides.
I love the fact that you said it should be a campaign, not an operation. You think of an operation as short-term, specific goal. You did it or you didn't. But a campaign is ongoing, an ongoing effort that potentially never stops. Do you think that we think that way?
We used to think that way. We used to think that way. We could. Absolutely, I still think the potential is there. I'm not going to lie to you and say we have to first dig out of the hole. Respectfully, we're not even at zero. We're a bit in the negative. We got to get out of the red and up into the positive game. But I do think we have the capability. The real question is not actually on so many of these fronts capability. The real question is one of will. Will you devote the time, the assets, the resources? And for many in Washington who, once they've seen this decline of will, they hedge on another resource, which is political capital. Will you devote the political capital to these problems? Or will you do this trend that we've seen folks take on for quite a while, which is to kick the can down the road? We may have an honest debate Joan, about military spending, for example. But I think something that if, the incoming president is keen to show himself as standing with the military, we'll find ways to get around this continuing resolution business that has really hampered the modernization of our armed forces, because I think this is somewhere where the left and the right can agree with him, which is you want the biggest, baddest, most lethal army on the planet because you want to not have to ever use it. Mm-hmm. And God forbid we have to use it without giving it the resources.
Wonderful. Such a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you for spending so much time with us again today. I always feel a lot smarter after these hours are over. And it's a campaign to get me smarter. It's not an operation.
No.
So.
No, we just got to get you in the post-COVID space. Everything will be fine.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you, Joan. Such a pleasure.